Back in the fall of 2021, I made a nearly 3-hour-long video discussing the Remedy Connected Universe. That term, Remedy Connected Universe, comes directly from a press release published in the summer of 2020. Signed by Sam Lake, the announcement reads, AWE, the first Remedy Connected Universe crossover event. You know we love to put Easter eggs into our games. But what if some of them were more than Easter eggs? What if it's all connected? By now, you have maybe seen the trailer for AWE, our next expansion for Control. For over 10 years, we've had a crazy dream. The idea that the tales told in some of our games would be connected to each other, a connected world of stories and events with shared characters and lore. Each game is a standalone experience, but each game is also a doorway into a larger universe with exciting opportunities for crossover events. Slowly, patiently, behind the scenes, we've been planning and plotting to make this a reality. I'm absolutely thrilled to tell you that now the time has come to take the first concrete step on this road, establishing Remedy Connected Universe. You have no idea how happy it makes me to be able to finally make this announcement. What took place in 2010 in Alan Wake is one of the cases that the Federal Bureau of Control has been investigating. The AWE expansion is the first official Remedy Connected Universe crossover event, bringing more Alan Wake lore into Control. And this is still just a humble beginning. We're already working hard on a future Remedy game that also takes place in this same universe. Since this announcement, there has been a lot of debate over which Remedy games are actually connected. Opinions on this matter tend to fall into one of two categories. Either the Remedy Connected Universe is composed of Alan Wake and Control, or it encompasses all of Remedy's games. The argument for excluding titles like Quantum Break or Max Payne usually comes down to the fact that Remedy doesn't own those properties, and that while Control or Alan Wake might make references to those games, they aren't necessarily canon. As we get closer and closer to the release of Alan Wake 2, I'm seeing this debate pop up online more and more often, and that word canon tends to be the thing that most people get hung up on. If the events of Quantum Break are to be considered canon, then why can we find a person playing the game Alan Wake inside of Quantum Break? If Alan Wake's American Nightmare is canon, then hasn't Alan already defeated Mr. Scratch and reunited with Alice? These are valid questions, and if we look at the Remedy Connected Universe as a linear narrative, then these anomalies just don't fit into the timeline. However, no one ever said that the lore of the RCU was supposed to be linear. And if you're paying close enough attention, you can see that Remedy has spent decades telling us not to look at it that way. 2001's Max Payne was the first Remedy game to feature a structured, cinematic-type narrative, but the story itself is told out of order. The first scene in the game takes place at the very end of the story, and the rest of the game is framed as a retelling of the events that led to that moment, narrated by Max Payne himself. This framing device of having the lead character narrate the story is used in every other major Remedy game after Max Payne. We're never entirely experiencing things from an objective or neutral point of view. We're always being guided by the impressions of the lead characters in these games. In Max Payne 1 and 2, the story opens up at the end of the narrative, and we're left to trust that Max is a reliable narrator, despite the fact that he's constantly popping pills, hallucinating, and rarely ever sleeping. Both of these stories are told out of order, even more so in the second game. In Alan Wake, the lines between narrator and narrative are blurred so hard that 13 years later, people are still speculating on just what it was that even happened in that game. The story of Quantum Break is told by Jack Joyce while he sits down for an interview that feels a lot more like an interrogation. Control is narrated in real time by Jesse Faden, but large chunks of the story are communicated to the player by characters who are nowhere to be found during the events of the game. None of these stories are straightforward or linear in any significant way, and between them, we have multiple references to meta-narratives, alternate timelines, alternate dimensions, and beings that have the power to not only see all of these different realities at once, but also to manipulate and influence them. If a fluid, non-linear take on storytelling is at the core of every Remedy narrative, then why wouldn't we apply a similar perspective when looking at the RCU? In many works of fiction, when there's a canonical series of stories, those stories can be placed in a timeline, and we can see how the events of one story influences another. Sometimes this is meticulously crafted, with great care taken to maintain continuity, and other times, certain elements of a story are retconned or changed for various reasons. In video games, this is often due to having different creative teams work on different entries to a series, and changes are made to better serve the narrative that the current team wants to convey. Other stories may appear to present a connected series of events, but when held to scrutiny, you can begin to see that the storytellers never really intended to present any sort of continuity, and instead they were just playing around with similar characters, settings, or themes. I think that the RCU contains examples of all these methods, and having a disproportionate focus on continuity is going to leave players missing out on the real richness and depth that can be found when viewing Remedy's games as part of one whole connected universe. To really get at the core of this idea, I think it's essential to think about the different types of connections that Remedy uses. The most linear, blatant, and copyright-friendly connections are obviously those between Alan Wake and Control. While Microsoft held the publishing rights to Alan Wake for many years, Alan Wake was always Remedy's property, and Control also belongs to Remedy. When Control was released, it was the first time that Remedy had full ownership of two different major properties, and so there was nothing stopping them from officially announcing that these stories were directly connected, which gave the Remedy Connected Universe a formally announced canonical timeline. The events that took place in Bright Falls were later investigated by the Federal Bureau of Control. It's a clear connection that can be infinitely built on, and the continuity between those games is now canon, except for the parts of Alan Wake that were retconned for Alan Wake Remastered. At this point, does that mean that the original version of Alan Wake is no longer considered canon? The announcement of the stories being connected took place over a year before Alan Wake Remastered was even announced, and the original game was never formally removed from the Remedy Connected Universe. Here we have the two stories that are widely considered to make up the core of the RCU, and we're already seeing anomalies that interfere with the concept of there being a strict Remedy canon. But I have to say, when it comes to discussing the RCU, I think that a lot of people use the word canon when they really mean continuity. Canon means a sanctioned or accepted group or body of related works. Those related works can still be canon, even if there are some inconsistencies in the overall continuity of any of the more directly related works. Continuity can be defined as the maintenance of continuous action and self-consistent detail in the various scenes of a movie or broadcast. In terms of continuity, the changes made to Alan Wake for Alan Wake Remastered are relatively small, and they really only exist to help further cement some of the links to Control that were established in Control. The idea of a federal agency focused on the unexplained was seemingly always a part of the larger story surrounding Alan Wake, but the specifics of that agency changed over time, and so it made sense to go back into Alan Wake and just firm things up a bit. These sorts of connections are what I'll call direct connections, wherein the events of one game have a direct impact on the events of another game. The events of Alan Wake formed the basis of the AWE expansion for Control, and in turn, Control laid some foundation for Alan Wake 2. And I think that it's safe to assume that Alan Wake 2 will contain something that links directly to what will eventually occur in Control 2. All of these direct connections serve to maintain continuity, at least continuity in the context of the crossover between Alan Wake and Control. The other types of connections that Remedy makes are less direct, and in most cases, they don't affect continuity, but they do affect the player's understanding of the narrative. One example of this sort of connection is the shoebox. Shoeboxes are an important part of Alan Wake's lore. Without getting too deep into things, there's a power in the story of Alan Wake, concentrated in a realm called the Dark Place. This power has the ability to influence reality. The shoebox is a device that allows items placed within it to be unaffected by the reality-shifting powers of the Dark Place. References to this shoebox can be found in Alan Wake, Control, and This House of Dreams, which is a blog written by Sam Lake. The entries on that blog are presented as being written by a woman named Samantha Wells, who had recently begun renovating an old house, and was using the blog to document the process. The blog is a sort of supplement to the stories of Alan Wake and Control, and direct references to the events that take place in the blog can be found in Control. Now, at the time of writing This House of Dreams, the Federal Bureau of Control was called the Federal Bureau of Altered World Events. That was the name that the agency had for several years, until it was changed at some point during the development of Control. Despite those inconsistencies in continuity, the events of This House of Dreams are still directly referenced in Control, which is an undeniable part of the RCU. So if Control is in the RCU, and the events of the blog appear in that game, shouldn't the blog also be considered canon? The continuity may be a bit askew due to the fact that the name of the bureau was changed, but aside from that one minor detail, everything else checks out. Things get even more complicated when we look at Quantum Break, which features a direct mention of This House of Dreams. Throughout Quantum Break, players will find many references to Alan Wake. The game's protagonist, Jack Joyce, can stumble across a copy of The Sudden Stop, which was a novel written by Alan Wake. He can also come across someone playing the game Alan Wake on a PC. At this point, some of these connections clearly clash with the continuity of the crossover between Alan Wake and Control, but they are still connections between the games. So how do they fit into the canon? Well, again, canon just means that a group of works are related, and that relationship isn't limited by continuity. These types of connections aren't meant to directly impact the characters or any crossover narrative. Instead, they impact the player. When the player sees Alan Wake being played on a PC in Quantum Break, they might be reminded of the instances in which Max Payne suspected that he existed inside of a video game. Or they might be reminded of Jesse Faden entering a realm that exists inside of an arcade cabinet. The idea of a Remedy protagonist being in a video game, whether they were totally aware of it or not, has been presented several times over the past couple of decades. There are countless other tropes like this that appear across multiple Remedy games, and in one sense, they're just Easter eggs, fun little inside jokes and references that reward players who are paying attention to those sorts of details. But in addition to that, these tropes that echo across multiple games start to accumulate and form a sort of mythology, with each repetition adding to the significance of those tropes. These recurring themes and situations are paralleled by the recurring cast members in Remedy games. For example, James McCaffrey was the voice of Max Payne, and then in Alan Wake, he was the voice of Thomas Zane, as well as the voice of Alex Casey, who, in part, is a clear reference to the character of Max Payne. In Control, McCaffrey returned to voice director Zachariah Trench, and players who are aware of his previous roles in Remedy games will begin to pick up on a sort of shared lineage between all of those characters. That's not to say that Max Payne, Thomas Zane, and Trench are the same character, but subtle references and subtext in Control definitely add an extra layer of depth for players who take the whole of Remedy's catalog into account when playing it. Dr. Casper Darling in Control is played by Matthew Peretta, who is also the voice of Alan Wake. Both characters have disappeared from their shared reality. Alan Wake is trapped in the dark place, with no way to consistently communicate with the outside world, and Dr. Darling has also disappeared, with the only evidence of him being a series of video messages that were recorded before his departure. These similarities are definitely intentional, and while the characters in the games aren't aware of those sorts of connections, the player can be, which creates an added dimension of depth that I think is a crucial part of the Remedy connected universe. Still, some players look at all of that and say, well, those are just Easter eggs and references. But to me, references are still connections. Some connections have a clear line between them, like the FBC investigating what happened to Alan Wake. And some connections aren't so linear, like the fact that documents in Quantum Break make direct references to people, places, and events found in Max Payne 2, Alan Wake's American Nightmare, and Control. But if you need more proof as to why those indirect connections are still important to the Remedy canon, and why the Remedy continuity is a whole lot more complicated than it might first appear to be, I think that Control itself contains one of the best explanations of the concept.
Any new dreams you'd like to share, Dylan?
I'm glad you asked, sister. This dream, like all dreams now, felt very real. Like reality. And reality now feels like a dream. Maybe it's all a dream. Maybe it's all real.
Dream where my brother endlessly tells me about his dreams.
I was in a dark place, and there was a dark man there. His name was Mr. Door, and he told me that there are many worlds, side by side, on top of each other, some inside of others. In one world, there was a writer who wrote a story about a cop. In another world, the cop was real. Door said he himself was in all of them at the same time, endlessly shifting between them. I asked him how I could reach these worlds. I wanted to bring the hiss there. But he didn't want to help me. He didn't like the idea. What did he know?
For me, that really lays it all out. The connections don't just travel one consistent current. They exist in all sorts of complicated and sometimes contradicting ways. But when we look at the games as a whole, they undoubtedly come together to enhance one another for anyone willing to dig into them as a body of related works, or a canon. Currently, the continuity that some people are looking for when they talk about which Remedy works are canon only exists in one dimension of the Remedy connected universe, and that dimension is the crossover between Alan Wake and Control, or more specifically, Alan Wake Remastered and Control. I think that crossover will continue to expand, But even if you wanted to disregard all connections made prior to the official announcement of the RCU, I have to believe that things are going to get much more complicated as time goes on. Remedy is currently working with Rockstar to develop a remake of the first 2 Max Payne games. Just prior to that project being announced, the Remedy-developed campaign for Crossfire X featured this hidden area. In the most direct way possible, Remedy presents the question, is it connected? And then proceeds to answer, yes, it's all connected. This is just my interpretation of things, but I don't see how it could be any more clear than that. Anyway, I touched on a lot of topics here that I explore in more depth in my longer video on the RCU. Be sure to check that one out if you haven't, and let me know what you think. Even though I feel pretty confident about my interpretation of things, I'm just presenting my theories, and there are plenty of other theories out there as well. Personally, I think that anything is possible, and the only thing I really want to do is urge players to not disregard all of the awesome information and connections that are present outside of just Alan Wake and Control. Meet me down in the comments, and if you like this video, leave a like. We upload new videos all the time, and we have a ton of other Remedy-related content on here that you might be interested in. So subscribe if you want to see more, and until next time, see ya.